Occupied France, August 1943. The air was heavy with dawn mist, and the smell of oil and metal lingered over a remote Luftwaffe airfield. Just after 0400 hours, Oberleutnant Vera Schultz, Chief Technical Officer of Jagdgeschwader 26, received a message that, on the surface, should have been a triumph. An American P-47 Thunderbolt had been forced down. Its pilot was captured. The aircraft itself, miraculously, was almost intact. For the Reich's Air Intelligence Division, this was gold, pure mechanical gold. For months, German pilots had encountered this massive American fighter and reported back in disbelief. Its power, its resilience, its ability to climb and dive at impossible speeds. Some thought it was propaganda. Others whispered that the Americans had found a way to cheat physics itself. Now, finally, they would see for themselves. When Schultz walked out onto the tarmac and saw the captured Thunderbolt for the first time, his reaction mirrored that of every Luftwaffe pilot who'd faced it in the air. The thing looked grotesque, an enormous, swollen beast of aluminum. To German eyes trained on the clean, predatory lines of a Bf-109 or Fw-190, this machine was an insult to aerodynamics, a flying milk bottle that seemed to defy grace and logic alike. But Schultz was not a man of impressions. He was an engineer, a quiet, methodical soul who believed that numbers never lied, even when appearances did. And as he began his meticulous inspection under the cold morning light, the man who trusted equations more than instinct began to uncover a truth that chilled him deeper than any winter wind. The P-47, he realized, wasn't grotesque at all. It was prophetic. Every bolt, every joint, every curve was a quiet declaration, proof that Germany had already lost a war it didn't yet understand. Schultz had never been a combat pilot. Before the war, he had worked for Messerschmitt, designing and testing aerodynamic systems. His role in Jagdgeschwader 26 was to analyze captured aircraft, identify weaknesses, and propose countermeasures for the frontline squadrons. But as he stood beside the Thunderbolt's massive frame, clipboard in hand, a strange unease settled over him. He had come here to study a machine. What he found instead was an industrial revelation. He began with the heart of the beast, the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp. When his team removed the cowling, they fell silent. Even the clatter of tools faded into the dawn. The engine loomed like a cathedral of steel and precision. 18 cylinders arranged in 2 perfect rings of 9, the great radial heart that gave the P-47 its unmistakable bulk. Yet what struck Schultz wasn't just its size, but its refinement. Every component gleamed with care. The machining was immaculate, the tolerances so fine, they almost sang. The crankshaft was not merely functional. It was art, the kind of metallurgy Germany had once prided itself on, but could no longer afford to produce, at scale. Schultz began to scribble figures into his notebook. Displacement, compression ratio, estimated boost pressure. The numbers told a story. This engine was producing over 2,000 horsepower, perhaps more, when the turbo supercharger kicked in. The Luftwaffe's own BMW 801D, the pride of the Fw-190, delivered barely 1,700 horsepower at maximum output, and that was when everything worked perfectly. The Americans, somehow, were mass-producing engines that outclassed Germany's best by 20 to 30%, and doing so without breaking a sweat. He examined the metal closely, searching for shortcuts, the telltale signs of desperation that now haunted German manufacturing. Lower-grade alloys, simplified castings, the scars of haste. But there were none. This engine was built the right way, not the expedient way. The aluminum was high-grade, the bearings smooth and even, the fittings hand-finished with almost obsessive precision. Schultz's assistant, a weathered mechanic who had spent years servicing Bf-109s, ran a hand along one of the cylinders and murmured, "Herr Oberleutnant, each cylinder is removable separately. You could replace just one if it failed." Schultz looked closer and nodded slowly. It was elegant, brilliantly logical. It meant faster repairs, less downtime, more aircraft back in the air. In the Luftwaffe, a damaged engine often meant weeks on the ground, waiting for parts or for entire units to be dismantled. This American design anticipated maintenance. It embraced it. Every inch of the Thunderbolt seemed to have been built with the expectation that war would be fought not just in the skies, but in the hangars and factories that sustained them. And then Schultz saw it, the true heart of the Thunderbolt's secret, not the engine itself, but what fed it, the turbo supercharger system. Reports had mentioned it, but seeing it in person was something else entirely. From the engine bay, a network of ducting snaked through the fuselage, down toward a turbine mounted in the aircraft's tail. The system used the engine's own exhaust gases to drive a compressor spinning at over 20,000 revolutions per minute, ramming pressurized air back into the cylinders. It was, in a word, audacious. To make it work, the Americans had solved problems that had defeated even Germany's best engineers. Heat resistance, balance, vibration, the impossibly tight tolerances required to spin a turbine at such speed without tearing itself apart. The tubing alone required alloys that could survive the inferno of exhaust temperatures. The bearings had to withstand rotational forces that would shred anything less than perfection. German research teams had tried. They had prototypes, but never a production model. The materials were too scarce, the machining too demanding, the labor too skilled to spare. And yet here it was, not in an experimental aircraft, not a secret prototype, but in a standard production fighter. One of hundreds, perhaps thousands. Schultz's pencil hesitated as he recalculated performance estimates. With this turbo supercharger, the P-47 could maintain full engine power at altitudes where the FW-190 and BF-109 were already gasping for air. Above 25,000 feet, where the Luftwaffe's best machines struggled, the Thunderbolt would be charging forward effortlessly, fast, stable, unstoppable. In that thin, freezing sky where bombers roamed and interception was life or death, the Americans would own the air. His assistant asked softly, "Can we build one, sir? Something like this?" Schultz exhaled, long and heavy. "Not with what we have left," he said. "This requires precision machining we can no longer sustain, high-grade steels, labor we no longer possess. We're already fighting to build what we have." His words trailed into silence. Around them, the early sun touched the P-47's fuselage, turning the dull silver skin into a pale mirror. It was beautiful in its defiance, a machine that embodied everything Germany could once dream of, but no longer reach. Still, duty demanded he finish the inspection. Schultz turned his attention to the airframe, moving along the wing where cannon fire had left dark, torn scars in the metal. He crouched, tracing his fingers over the punctures. These weren't superficial wounds. Several 20mm hits had punched through. Any German fighter would have been shredded. And yet, this aircraft had flown back, landed, controlled, alive. He studied the pattern, how the rounds had torn through the outer skin, yet failed to compromise the internal structure. Heavy-gauge aluminum plating, reinforced spars, redundant control cables running in parallel, so if one line failed, another kept the machine responsive. Layer upon layer of resilience. He'd read combat reports, Luftwaffe pilots pouring fire into Thunderbolts, watching them absorb hit after hit and still climb away, smoking but defiant. He had assumed exaggeration. Now, seeing the wreck before him, he understood. The P-47 was not built like a fighter at all. It was built like a tank with wings. Where German design worshipped agility and lightness, this machine embraced endurance. Its cockpit was a fortress, steel armor wrapped around the pilot from every angle. The windscreen was a slab of armored glass, thick enough to shrug off rounds that would shatter most canopies. Even the control panels seemed arranged with a kind of pragmatic kindness, as if the designers had asked themselves, what will the pilot need when everything goes wrong? For Schultz, it was more than engineering. It was philosophy. The P-47 wasn't just a machine of war. It was a statement about how America fought, with scale, with resources, with the quiet certainty that industry itself was a weapon. Every rivet whispered that this nation could build 10 more for everyone that fell. And in that realization, something within him, the engineer, the patriot, the man, began to break. He closed his notebook, the pencil trembling slightly between his fingers. Around him, the airfield remained still, the hum of distant engines a faint reminder that the war above never slept. The Thunderbolt sat in silence, its metal skin glinting in the morning haze, battered, scarred, but utterly unbowed. Schultz stood there for a long time, his reflection faintly visible on its fuselage, and in that reflection, he saw not an enemy's triumph, but a mirror of what his own nation had lost. Somewhere beyond the horizon, another P-47's engine might have been waking, its deep, confident rumble rolling through the sky like distant thunder. And that sound, steady, relentless, inevitable, was the sound of a new age rising. But most importantly, the R-2800 radial engine was more than a machine, it was a fortress. Unlike the fragile liquid-cooled inline engines that powered the Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, the radial carried no veins of coolant to be pierced, no vital lifeline waiting to bleed out under enemy fire. It was a brute mass of steel and motion. You could punch holes through its cylinders, rip metal from its casing, and still it would roar back, staggering but alive. Schultz had seen the reports himself. Thunderbolts limping home with cylinders shattered, wings ragged, control surfaces gone as if chewed by invisible teeth. Yet somehow they made it back. German fighters, wounded to such a degree, would have been swallowed by the clouds long before reaching friendly soil. One of Schultz's engineers said it softly, almost as a confession. It's over-engineered. The man's tone held both admiration and disbelief. They've built it too heavy, added metal where they could have gained speed. Schultz nodded slowly, eyes tracing the P-47's blueprints as though they were maps of another civilization. Yes, he replied, but they can't afford to. He tapped a finger on the figure for engine power. They have the horsepower to carry the weight. We don't. We build for precision, for efficiency, because we must. They build for endurance, because they can. That single exchange revealed the gulf between two worlds. Germany designed machines at the knife's edge of what was possible, light, fast, exquisitely tuned, but brittle when pushed beyond limits. America, by contrast, built with overwhelming margins, layering strength upon strength, as if expecting the world to strike back, and still wanting their creations to survive. Theirs was a doctrine of brute certainty, and brutally, it was working. Schultz turned his attention to the P-47's weaponry next. 8 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns, 4 mounted in each wing, stared back at him like cold eyes. He ran the numbers in silence. 400 rounds per gun. That meant 3,200 rounds in total. When fired together, those 8 guns spat over 100 rounds every second. He let the pencil fall from his hand. 1 second burst would throw 100 pieces of lead, each nearly half an inch wide, into a target. 2 seconds, 200. German fighters, by comparison, carried perhaps 2 or 4 machine guns and a cannon or 2, never this much. Ammunition loads were smaller, bursts shorter, the margin for error thinner. A Bf-109 might have 60 cannon shells and 500 machine gun rounds. That was enough for a handful of passes, then home. A P-47, on the other hand, could sustain fire for 30 seconds straight. In the air, 30 seconds was an eternity, long enough for several engagements before even thinking of resupply. But it wasn't only quantity that unsettled Schultz. It was the quality, the nature of the rounds themselves. He examined the 50 caliber cartridges, heavy brass casings that gleamed faintly under the light. Each projectile carried mass and speed enough to tear through armor, fuel lines, or the very bones of an aircraft. Pilots described the P-47's bursts as a wall of lead, a phrase Schultz had once dismissed as exaggeration. Now, looking at the geometry of 8 converging gun lines, he realized it was no metaphor. Within that cone of fire, everything simply ceased to exist. German fighters, lightly built, agile but fragile, would unravel under that storm. A Thunderbolt didn't need finesse. It only needed alignment. Once the target drifted into view, a squeeze of the trigger was enough to erase it. Schultz scribbled a single line in his notes. Avoid head-on engagements with P-47s. Probability of survival minimal. Yet, as he dug deeper, he began to understand something larger, a truth that stretched beyond the P-47 itself. Every rivet, every cable, every polished cylinder whispered of an industrial base so vast it defied comprehension. The R-2800 engine alone demanded alloys and tolerances that many nations could scarcely dream of. Its turbo-supercharger required rare metals and intricate machining. The airframe demanded rivers of aluminum, shaped and fitted with precision. Even the ammunition implied a network of factories, mines, and transport that ran like arteries across a continent. For Germany, producing even one of those systems at scale would have strained every resource. Yet the Americans had woven them all together, engine, armament, airframe, electronics, into a single machine, and then multiplied it thousands of times. Schultz sent for production data from intelligence sources, and when it arrived, he felt a quiet chill move through him. Republic Aviation was building over 500 Thunderbolts a month. Within a year, they aimed for 800. Meanwhile, all of Germany's factories combined struggled to deliver 300 to 400 single-engine fighters in total. Bf-109s, FW-190s, all types counted together, and that output was constantly interrupted by the rumble of Allied bombs falling overhead. But the deeper numbers struck hardest. The R-2800 engine was not exclusive to the P-47. It powered other American aircraft, bombers, twin-engine fighters, even naval planes. By the end of the war, over 125,000 of these engines would roll off assembly lines. Schultz did the math twice, then again, certain he'd erred. But no, the figures held. The United States had produced more of a single advanced engine type than Germany had produced of all aircraft engines combined. Each R-2800 generated around 2,000 horsepower. Most German engines offered barely half that. The imbalance wasn't just numerical, it was elemental. He stared at the papers on his desk, the ink still drying, the calculations like ghosts, whispering truths he did not want to write down. In 1943 alone, American aircraft production was set to exceed 85,000 units. Germany's, barely 25,000, 3 to 1 in number. Yet when weight and complexity were considered, the difference was even wider. A single B-17 bomber consumed as much aluminum and labor as 3 Bf-109s, and America was building thousands of them, casually, relentlessly, as if industry itself were a weapon. The realization was suffocating. America was not merely fighting Germany, it was sustaining Britain, fueling the Soviet armies with machines and steel, feeding entire fronts while still expanding its own might. It was a war of factories now, and Germany was losing that war before the pilots even took off. Schultz gathered his documents for the final report to be sent to Berlin. His words were careful but unflinching. He wrote that the P-47 Thunderbolt represented a level of industrial and technological sophistication beyond Germany's current reach, that its production scale implied American capacity far greater than previous intelligence had assumed. His recommendation was plain: avoid combat with Thunderbolts at high altitude. Strategically, he warned that continuing attrition against superior numbers and superior technology would lead to irreversible loss. In more human words, it meant, we cannot win this fight if we continue to fight this way. When his commanding officer read the report, he lingered in silence, eyes tracing the final paragraphs. At last, he looked up, half respect, half sorrow. "You know this won't be welcomed in Berlin," he said quietly. Schultz asked, already knowing, "Should I change it?" The reply came after a pause. "No, the truth is the truth, but be prepared. They don't take kindly to truths that wound pride." The report ascended through the channels of command. Schultz never received an official reply, but rumors trickled back. A staff officer had dismissed it outright. Defeatist, someone had called him. He's been softened by enemy propaganda. American machines are crude, ours are superior. Schultz could almost hear the tone, pride wrapped around denial. He'd seen it before. Whenever data conflicted with ideology, the data was discarded, yet the experience left him changed. Examining the Thunderbolt was not simply a study in engineering. It was a mirror held up to the war itself. In the months that followed, Schultz watched the skies fill with the very aircraft his report had warned about. The P-47s grew in number, their deep engines echoing across Europe like distant drums. German losses rose, each pilot replaced by one with fewer hours, less training, less hope. His tactical suggestions, avoid high altitudes, strike and disengage, were eventually adopted, but too late. By then, the sky itself belonged to America, and still Schultz kept working, studying other captured planes, the P-38, the B-24, each telling the same story in a different dialect. A story of industry without exhaustion, of power built not just from machines, but from the unseen rhythm of factories and workers half a world away. Some nights, when the air raids grew quiet and the corridors of the airfield settled into uneasy stillness, Schultz would return to his notes on the P-47. He would trace the outline of its radial engine with a fingertip, almost gently, as if touching the surface of a secret. The paper smelled faintly of oil and dust. Outside, in the hangar, a captured Thunderbolt rested under tarps, silent, unbroken, defiant, even in captivity. And in the stillness, when the lights flickered and the wind moved through the rafters, it almost seemed as though that sleeping giant breathed again, one slow, steady pulse of power echoing through the dark. Superior materials, intricate systems, layers of design that spoke of a nation capable of producing not just machines, but the machinery to build machines. That was what Schultz saw as he moved from one captured American aircraft to the next. Every bolt, every panel, every precisely riveted line of metal was a quiet testament to an industrial might that Germany could neither imitate nor overwhelm. He stood once beside a captured C-47 transport, its olive-gray skin still bearing the faint scuffs of cargo and time. 10,000 more just like it would roll from American factories before the war's end. Germany's entire transport fleet, by comparison, could be counted in mere hundreds, many of them relics of another era patched and repurposed, like echoes of an army marching backward through time. Then came the Mustang, sleek, slender, and fast. The P-51 combined the range of the Thunderbolt with the grace of a duelist. Beneath its long nose purred a Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin, the British heart reborn in American steel. Thousands of them, rolling from assembly lines that never slept. Schultz ran a hand over its wing edge, tracing the flow of metal that looked almost organic, like muscle under skin. Here was flight distilled into its purest form, range, speed, and power, working in harmony. Each aircraft he examined whispered the same unflinching truth. Germany was losing not to tactics or courage, but to an enemy that had turned industry itself into a weapon. What haunted Schultz most was not ignorance, but awareness. The intelligence existed. Reports from German agents in America painted the same picture of vast production lines and endless convoys. Captured aircraft confirmed it in aluminum and oil, but in Berlin, the data was seen through the prism of ideology. The leadership knew, yet refused to accept, that they were facing a storm too large to outfly. They clung to faith in German will, in the belief that superior tactics, discipline, and ingenuity could offset the weight of material inferiority. Schultz, an engineer by training and conviction, could not think that way. For him, truth was measured in equations, not speeches. Steel, horsepower, and man-hours, those were the languages he understood, and the numbers were merciless. Germany was being buried under a rising tide of American metal, an avalanche whose momentum no courage could stop. After the war, when production records were finally opened, Schultz's wartime estimates were revealed to have been conservative. He had, without realizing, underestimated America's true capacity. From 1940 to 1945, the United States produced more than 300,000 aircraft. Germany, in that same span, built around 94,000. Even those figures failed to capture the imbalance in scale. America had built over 15,600 P-47 Thunderbolts alone, more than Germany had produced of both its primary fighters, the Bf-109 and Fw-190, combined. And the mighty R-2800 engine that had once left Schultz in awe. Over 125,000 of those engines would be made, not only by Pratt & Whitney, but by Ford, Chevrolet, and a dozen other automotive giants reshaped into the sinews of war. It was a mobilization unlike anything in human history. Factories that had once turned out cars now birthed bombers. Shipyards that had built cargo vessels now assembled aircraft carriers under the glow of arc lamps. The entire American economy seemed to pulse toward a single heartbeat. Production. And yet, quantity alone didn't tell the whole story. Even as output soared, quality never fell. Late war American aircraft showed none of the desperate shortcuts that plagued their enemies. The rivets held, the welds were clean, the engines, though produced in thousands, purred with precision. By contrast, German aircraft began to bear the marks of strain, thinner metals, simplified structures, uneven assembly. Resource shortages meant lower-grade alloys. Skilled workers were drafted into combat, replaced by forced laborers who worked under duress and exhaustion. It wasn't incompetence, it was collapse, disguised as adaptation. Schultz lived through it all, surviving to see the war's final months and the silence that followed. When the guns at last fell quiet, he was taken into custody by American technical officers, men who spoke with professional curiosity rather than hostility. They'd found his 1943 report on the P-47 among captured files and wanted to hear it from his own mouth. "Did you truly believe," one officer asked, "that from examining a single aircraft you could foresee Germany's defeat?" Schultz paused before answering. His eyes, tired but steady, reflected neither pride nor bitterness. "I concluded," he said softly, "that Germany could not win an industrial war against America. The P-47 was not just a fighter, it was evidence. Every component, every circuit, every screw represented resources, manpower, and infrastructure that exceeded all of Germany's capabilities combined." The American officer nodded, intrigued. "But you were only one engineer. Surely others saw the same thing." "Many did," Schultz replied, "but in the Third Reich, truth could be treason. Facts that contradicted ideology were dangerous to speak aloud. It was safer to remain silent than to be branded defeatist. The officer reached into a folder and drew out a copy of Schultz's report. "We found this marked filed. No action required. Did that surprise you?" Schultz gave a low, almost weary laugh. "No, I expected it. They didn't want intelligence. They wanted affirmation. When reality clashed with belief, belief won every time." And that, perhaps, was the heart of the tragedy. The story of Werner Schultz and his captured Thunderbolt was not merely about machines. It was about blindness. It was the story of a man who looked at the evidence and saw the inevitable long before it unfolded. His findings mirrored those of others whose warnings were similarly ignored. Admiral Canaris, who cautioned about America's industrial strength. Albert Speer, who understood that no amount of efficiency could close the production gap. General Galland, who recognized the P-47's tactical dominance. Even Sepp Dietrich, who foresaw the Ardennes offensive collapsing for lack of fuel. Each saw the same truth from a different angle. Each spoke it, and each was quietly dismissed as defeatist. The regime clung to a fatal faith that racial and cultural superiority could triumph over steel, that passion could outproduce factories, that ideology could rewrite mathematics. In such a system, truth had no oxygen. The very men capable of understanding the battlefield of industry were silenced by the battlefield of pride. Schultz's report, had it been heeded, might have shifted strategy, perhaps even slowed the inevitable. It should have sparked a re-evaluation of Germany's position in the war of machines. Instead, it was buried, literally filed away, forgotten amid the piles of paper and delusion. The Thunderbolt, meanwhile, soared into legend. Over 15,600 were built. They flew escort for bombers, tore through Luftwaffe formations, and raked armored columns from the skies above Europe. Their roar became the soundtrack of a changing war. The very aircraft Schultz had studied in silence became one of the blades that carved Germany's fate. And so, in the end, the war that Schultz had foreseen played out exactly as his equations had whispered. Not a war of soldiers against soldiers, nor even of generals against generals, but of factories against factories, foundries against foundries. The side with more oil, more aluminum, more hands on the assembly lines would prevail. America had all of these in abundance. Germany had none left to give. When the war was finally over, Schultz would sometimes think back to that day in 1943 when he stood beside a captured P-47 and ran his fingers along its cold fuselage. He hadn't seen just a plane. He had seen the future, loud, metallic, and unstoppable. And in the quiet years that followed, he would sometimes recall that feeling again. The faint scent of oil, the ticking of cooling metal, and the way the hangar lights had glinted off the Thunderbolt's curved skin, like dawn reflecting on the armor of a sleeping giant.